All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today, we're going to be taking a look at Apple's performance in early 2024.
Okay.
And by early, I mean the first half of their fiscal year 2024,
Right.
which, just as a reminder, that's October 2023 to March 2024.
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing this by strapping ourselves in for a wild ride through their 10Q reports.
Really getting in the weeds.
Exactly, the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. 10Q reports, those dense, super long documents companies file with the SEC.
Right.
Yeah, those ones.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to actually read those.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, you could, but
You could, but you'd probably rather be doing something a little more exciting. Yeah. And that's why we have our expert here today to guide us through all that financial jargon to what really matters for you, our listeners, whether you're already an Apple investor, thinking about taking the plunge, or just curious about what this tech giant is up to.
yeah. And what's really valuable about these 10Qs, even though they are a bit of a slog to get through, is that we're getting Apple's own unfiltered take on how they're doing, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Straight from Tim Apple himself.
Yeah, essentially. This goes way beyond the carefully curated headlines you see in the news, right? It's their raw perspective.
I like it.
Yeah.
So no sugarcoating here,
No, not at all.
just the cold, hard numbers.
Yep, exactly.
So let's dive right into those numbers, shall we? Apple's overall revenue for the first half of their fiscal year 2024 stayed pretty much flat compared to last year. But I'm sensing a but coming here
Yeah.
because things always get way more interesting when we dig a little deeper.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
This is where the story gets really juicy.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
You know, remember the whole crossroads idea from the outline?
Yeah.
Well, this is it.
Okay.
The first half of Apple's year really reflects a company that's juggling these huge successes with some pretty significant challenges.
Ooh, okay, set the scene for us. What did their performance actually look like quarter by quarter?
So they actually started 2024 strong.
Okay.
Q1, which covers October to December of 2023, they saw a 2% increase in their total net sales compared to the same time last year.
Okay, so a small but still positive start.
Right.
What was driving that early growth spurt?
Couple of things. iPhones definitely played a role, especially their higher-end Pro models.
Makes sense. Those are the ones with all the bells and whistles.
Exactly. Seems like people are willing to shell out the big bucks for those premium features.
Yeah. You know, Apple's good at pushing the envelope. Got to give them that.
For sure.
But what about their services? You know, Apple Music, Apple TV, all those subscriptions?
Yeah.
Those have been a big focus for them lately.
They have, and for good reason, too. Services brought in a very respectable 11% more revenue in Q1 compared to the year before.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so that tells me, and it probably tells you, that people are really buying into this whole Apple ecosystem.
It's not just about the device anymore.
It's not just about the device.
It's like they want you living in an Apple-flavored world.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. It's the whole experience they're selling now.
The whole shebang. But then, things took a bit of a turn in Q2, didn't they?
Yeah, Q2, which covers January to March of 24, was a little bumpier of a ride.
Okay.
Total net sales for the quarter actually dipped 4% compared to the year before.
A 4% dip, that's not insignificant.
No, not at all.
What happened? Did people suddenly stop loving their iPhones?
Well, iPhone sales did take a bit of a hit, down 10% for the quarter. And it wasn't just iPhones. iPads weren't doing too hot either. They were down a much steeper 22% over the first half of the year.
Oof, that's rough.
And even the wearables, home, and accessories category, which includes things like the Apple Watch and AirPods, even that saw a dip.
Wow, so even the once untouchable wearables category is showing signs of weakness.
Yeah, it seems so.
That's got to be a warning sign for Apple.
It's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Were there any bright spots at all in Q2, or was it just all downhill from there?
I mean, there were glimmers of hope services. Those kept up their hot streak, growing an impressive 14% in Q2.
Wow. Okay, so even with the dip in hardware sales, subscriptions are still going strong.
Absolutely. And this really highlights Apple's big strategic shift towards what they call a recurring revenue model, which you see them emphasize a lot in these 10Qs.
So instead of just making a one-time sale when you buy a new iPhone, they want to create these ongoing relationships with customers through subscriptions.
Precisely.
It's like the difference between selling someone a fishing rod or selling them a lifetime membership to a fishing club.
I like that analogy.
One's a quick win, the other's a long-term play.
Exactly. And the success of their services, it proves that people are willing to subscribe to this Apple ecosystem. But the big question is, can this momentum in services really offset the slowing hardware sales in the long run?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is, and the answer, my friend, is far from clear.
All right, so we've got this fascinating tension, right? Overall flat revenue, but with services surging and some of those core hardware products kind of struggling.
Yeah.
Now I'm dying to know how Apple's global performance plays into all of this.
It's a great question.
Because they're not just selling to us here.
Right. No, they are a global company.
Yeah, everywhere.
Exactly. And that means they're dealing with different currencies, they're dealing with different economies, different consumer tastes.
Right, it's a whole different ballgame.
It is, and it's not a one-size-fits-all answer when you look at their global performance, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. Each region has its own, like, economic climate, its own trends, you know?
The whole world out there.
It is, it is.
So where were the bright spots on the map for Apple? And where did things get, well, a little messy?
Okay, let's start with the Americas, shall we?
Apple's home turf.
Exactly. Now, their performance there, it was actually pretty flat compared to last year.
Okay.
But here's the thing, and this is important. The U.S. dollar has been super strong lately.
Yeah, that's been all over the news.
Right. And that actually makes Apple's products more expensive in other countries.
Oh, right, because of the exchange rates and all that.
Exactly. And that can hurt sales, you know?
It's like when you're on vacation and you try to buy a souvenir and you're like, wait, this cute little trinket costs how much in my money?
Exactly. It's the same principle at play, just on a much larger scale.
Economics 101.
There you go. And that strong dollar effect, we saw that pop up in Europe, too.
Really?
Yeah, they did see a small increase in sales, like 1% growth in the first half of the year.
Okay, so not nothing.
Right. Not nothing, but still, that pesky dollar probably softened the blow of what could have been even stronger growth, you know?
It's like a hidden tax on those European Apple fans.
In a way, yeah, you could see it that way.
So not exactly fireworks in those usually reliable markets.
No, not really.
Interesting. But what about the rest of the world? Any big surprises there?
Oh, definitely. Remember how we were talking about Apple being at a crossroads?
Yeah, the whole juggling act.
Right. Well, nowhere is that more evident than in Greater China.
China. The land of, well, booming tech and a massive market for Apple.
Exactly.
So what's the story there? Spill the tea.
All right. So in Q1, their sales in Greater China, they plunged.
Plunged. Like how much are we talking?
By 13%.
13. That's like losing a whole French fry order.
It's a significant drop, especially considering how important the Chinese market is to Apple's bottom line.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
What's driving that downturn? Did Chinese consumers suddenly decide they don't like iPhones anymore?
Well, the 10Qs don't explicitly lay out every single reason.
Right, of course.
But they do kind of hint at a few things.
Okay, like what?
Well, increased competition from local Chinese brands is definitely a factor.
Oh yeah, those homegrown companies have been stepping up their game.
They have. They've been really impressive.
It's like a game of musical chairs. And everyone's trying to grab a seat in that Chinese market.
That's a great way to put it. And then, of course, you've got the whole economic picture in China, which has been a bit uncertain lately.
Right, lots of talk about slowing growth and all that.
Exactly.
So what's Apple's grand plan for navigating this whole situation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the 10Qs, they don't really get into specific strategies.
They wouldn't, would they?
No, but you can tell that Apple's well aware of the challenges. They're not shying away from discussing it.
Okay.
They emphasize the importance of the Chinese market, and knowing Apple, they're likely working on ways to, adapt and try to regain their footing.
I can only imagine the brainstorming sessions happening at Apple HQ right now.
Right.
But let's not get too sidetracked by that image. What about other parts of Asia? How did they do?
So Japan actually had a pretty strong start in Q1 with a 15% jump in sales.
Wow. Okay.
But then they cooled off considerably in Q2.
So a bit of a roller coaster ride there.
Yeah, you could say that.
And what about the rest of the Asia-Pacific region?
It was pretty much a consistent decline in both quarters.
Okay, so a real mixed bag globally with some real challenges starting to pop up.
Yeah, it's definitely a more complex picture than it might seem at first glance.
It sounds like Apple's got some tough decisions ahead.
For sure.
But hey, this is Apple we're talking about. They're still insanely profitable, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Those margins must be keeping investors pretty happy, even with all these challenges.
That's a thing. While Apple is still incredibly profitable, those margins, they are starting to feel the squeeze.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the 10Qs don't hide that fact.
Okay, so break this down for our listeners who might not be financial experts. What are we talking about when we say margins, and why should they care?
Okay, imagine this. You're selling those beautiful hand-knitted scarves online.
Okay, I'm imagining.
All right, so the margin is basically the difference between what it costs you to make that scarf, the yarn, your time, shipping, all of that, and what you actually sell it for.
Okay, so it's like the profit you make on each scarf.
Exactly. Higher margins mean more profit for every scarf you sell.
Makes sense.
And in Apple's case, those margins are what allow them to invest in all those cool new products, research and development, all the things that keep them ahead of the game.
Right. It's how they stay innovative and competitive.
Exactly. But, as we were saying, those margins are under pressure.
So what's eating away at Apple's metaphorical scarf profits?
Well, we've already talked about how that strong dollar can impact their international sales, right?
Right. The strong dollar strikes again.
Exactly. But then on top of that, you've got rising production costs.
Oh, right, because components for all these devices aren't getting any cheaper.
No, they are not. Things are getting more expensive, which eats into those margins.
It's like trying to bake a cake, but the price of eggs and flour has suddenly skyrocketed.
That's a great analogy.
Suddenly, each slice of cake costs more to make.
Exactly. And on top of all that, you've got Apple pouring resources into growing that services side of the business, which, while promising, also requires a lot of upfront investment.
It's like they're betting big on the future, but they've got to manage these immediate costs at the same time.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure. It is. It really is. And they're walking that tightrope. But hey, this is Apple we're talking about, right?
Right, they've juggled their way out of tight spots before.
Exactly. They've got a knack for it. But speaking of challenges,
Oh, here we go.
the 10Qs also hint at some legal and regulatory battles that could have a real impact on Apple's future and, yeah, potentially even those comfy margins we were just talking about.
Okay, yeah, those are a whole other can of worms.
They are.
We're talking about things like that whole Epic Games lawsuit, the Massimo patent infringement case, and even the DOJ taking a closer look at them for potential monopolization. These things could get pricey.
Oh, absolutely. These legal challenges, they're definitely something to watch because they could have major financial and operational consequences for Apple down the line.
Yeah, the stakes are high.
They are. Take the Epic Games case, for instance.
Ah, yes. Epic Games, the makers of Fortnite.
Right, exactly. That whole showdown was about Apple's control over its App Store, the fees they charge developers.
Yeah, it was a real clash of the titans, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Epic, this gaming giant going head-to-head with Apple, the tech behemoth.
Exactly. And remember, this went all the way to the Supreme Court.
It did. It was a whole thing.
It was a big deal. And while the Supreme Court mostly sided with Apple, they upheld most of their App Store policies.
Okay.
But the lower court did force Apple to make a concession. Remember those external links we talked about earlier?
Oh, right. The ones that let developers tell users about other ways to pay for stuff outside of Apple's system.
Exactly. Apple now has to allow those in their apps.
Wow, so that's a pretty big deal.
It is. It's a shift in the power dynamic, even if it's a subtle one. And Apple had to make changes. They implemented a new system back in 2023.
Right.
But of course, Epic is now saying that Apple's implementation still doesn't comply with the court's ruling.
They're still fighting.
Oh, yeah. It's a classic case of the legal battles never really being over,
Like a tennis match, back and forth.
Exactly. Millions, maybe even billions of dollars at stake.
And then there's that Massimo case, right?
Huh.
The one with the health tracking technology.
Right. Massimo, they make these medical monitoring devices.
And they're saying Apple ripped them off.
Essentially, yeah. Massimo claims Apple infringed on some of their patents related to those blood oxygen sensors used in the Apple Watch,
Oh, wow. So with Apple pushing further into the healthcare space with the Apple Watch,
Yeah.
that case could have huge implications.
Absolutely. And then let's not forget about the European Commission. They're not letting Apple off easy either.
Right. The EU has been cracking down on big tech.
They have been. They've opened up investigations under the Digital Markets Act, the DMA for short, which is essentially the EU's way of trying to make sure those big tech companies play fair in the digital world.
So the DMA, it's kind of like the EU saying, all right, big tech, we love what you're doing, but you can't just steamroll everyone else in the sandbox.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about preventing companies like Apple from stifling competition and really giving those smaller players a fighting chance.
Leveling the playing field.
Exactly.
But even with those legal battles and the EU breathing down their neck, Apple's still raking in the dough.
Oh, absolutely.
And they're not hoarding it all for themselves either. We've got to talk about those massive share buybacks and those dividend payments. Those are definitely putting smiles on some investors' faces.
They are. Just in Q2, they spent a mind-boggling $23.5 billion buying back their own shares.
$23.5 billion, that's enough to buy a small country.
Right. And on top of that, they paid out another $3.7 billion in dividend.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't Wall Street wizards, what does all this share buyback stuff actually mean?
So imagine it like this. When a company buys back its own shares, it's basically saying, we believe our stock is undervalued, so we're going to buy some ourselves.
They're betting on themselves.
Exactly. And that reduces the number of shares out there, which can increase the value of the remaining shares.
So it's a way to reward investors who are already on board.
Exactly. It's a way to say, thank you for sticking with us.
It makes you wonder, though, is this really the best use of all that cash, especially with all these challenges on the horizon? Couldn't they use that money to, I don't know, develop some groundbreaking new products or maybe beef up their legal team for all those lawsuits?
You've hit on a really important debate that's always swirling around companies like Apple. Should they prioritize giving money back to shareholders through buybacks and dividends, or should they reinvest that money back into the company itself?
The age-old dilemma, short-term rewards versus long-term growth.
Exactly, and it's a tough balancing act.
No doubt. So we've covered a ton of ground here, from booming services to those slumping iPhone sales, from Apple's challenges in China to their legal battles around the world. If we had to sum up the story these 10Q reports are telling us about Apple, what would it be? What's the headline?
For me, it's all about this pivotal moment for Apple, this real crossroads they're at.
They're at a crossroads. We've used that word a lot today.
And I think it's really appropriate. They are still a financial powerhouse. There's no doubt about that. But things are changing.
How are you going to do about it?
Right.
Right.
How are they going to respond to these shifting tides? Can they reignite the growth in those key markets like China? Can those services keep exceeding expectations? And can they navigate these legal challenges without it impacting their bottom line too much? These are the big questions that are going to determine Apple's future.
It's a cliffhanger for sure. Well, on that note, we'll leave you, our listeners, to ponder what the future holds for this tech giant. One thing's for sure, though, the Apple saga is far from over.
Oh, absolutely not. This is just the beginning of another chapter.
If anything, things are just getting interesting. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Apple's financial waters. We'll catch you next time for another exciting exploration.